Hey everyone, and welcome to First Impressions, where we get to do a deep dive into a certain part of technology or service that's important to publishers. It's our unboxing video, if you will. It's the closest I can come to being culturally relevant, is to focus on ad tech, and yet at the same time, I always learn stuff in these sessions, and I know today I am for certain going to, because the company that we're talking to, 5x5, is doing some really interesting stuff, and we're with Nick. Nick, you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into what 5x5 does.
Well, Rob, I appreciate that you consider us as your lifeline to staying relevant. So thanks. Thanks for that. Nick Weldon, CEO and co-founder of 5x5. We founded and Rob, you want me to just jump into
Yeah, let's
some
hear
of
about
what?
let's hear your origin story.
Perfect.
Fascinating.
So, we found 5x5 is really that classic accidental startup story. So my co-founder and I, we were building a product about 5 years ago, where the product was incredibly dependent on additional data for it to be able to deliver on the customer experience and really the value prop we were bringing to market. And so Brian and I went through. Brian has a long tenure in the data world with has worked at many of the large data broker companies out there. And so even with his connections, we couldn't secure the proper amount of data for us to be able to reliably build the product we wanted to without going and having to raise a massive funding round. And so Brian and I had this idea of, what if we could create a community of platforms and companies that needed data to improve their product or service and also generated small amounts of data. So the amount of data they generated on their own wasn't enough to deliver on the value prop that they wanted to their customers. However, the thesis we had is, if we could get many of these platforms that all generate a small amount of data together, we could create a massive data set that we could all control and leverage to improve our products and services. And so the idea was just to get a few people into this cooperative that we were thinking about, and we could all get a little bit of data, improve our products, we could delay our funding round. And within a few months, it was Rob, I'm sure you've experienced a lot of this. It was that, hey, you got to go talk to Nick and Brian. They got this cool thing going on. And what was a few of those turned into a lot of those, and it turned into the 5x5 Data Cooperative. And so fast forward to today, the 5x5 Data Cooperative has hundreds of members in it. These members are companies who are building MarTech solutions like email service providers. These are companies who are sales tech platforms building sales acceleration, CRMs. These are demand gen agencies calling and emailing. These are HR tech platforms that are using it for recruiting or candidate enrichment type use cases. All of these platforms have a need for additional data added and baked into their product and or service if they're on the demand gen side. And so one of the things we noticed was that in kind of recent history here is that a lot of the same use cases that we had experienced in the sales, MarTech, HR tech space, there was a massive need for data enrichment in the publisher world. And that's, I think, a big area we wanted to focus on some of the learnings we've had and challenges we're seeing and how we're starting to see some of those get solved, et cetera.
Well, you certainly hit on something I think every company that I know of is feeling, other than a few very, very large ones. And we'll talk about kind of the walled gardens, but almost everyone is sitting there thinking about, again, how do I, um, whatever data work I'm working with, how do I get more of it? How do I add more to it? Right. So what's interesting in what you just said there, that I think for the publisher space is really interesting right off the bat, is that the data that itself isn't just coming from kind of a publisher created method, right? Of, oh, someone went to a website and therefore have a behavior. You're talking about other companies kind of being involved in helping kind of pull this data together. Is that accurate?
It is. And I'll share a graphic here because I think this will be helpful to really hone in on how 5x5 works. And Rob, can you see
Yes.
the
Perfect.
graphic here? So the members, as I was referring to in this cooperative model on the left side, and there's more beyond this, but here's some of the key ones: email service providers, demand and supply side platforms, CDPs, sales acceleration platforms, et cetera. All of them have users on their platform, and in some cases, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users, all using data, interacting with data. Our point of view is some of the most high quality data out there is activity level data. The best way to know if an email works, send an email. Best way to know if a phone number works, dial the number. And so these platforms all have users who are actively using data on their platform for different marketing initiatives, sales initiatives, et cetera. That data feeds into 5x5. And in some cases, it could be a small agency sending tens of thousands of emails to month to an ESP, maybe sending billions of emails a month. That all flows into our 5x5 graph. And so what our graph connects, think of it starting at the individual, at a person level. So you have a kind of a unique person ID that is persistent to that person. And the goal we're trying to do is connect as much previous and current information about that person, and then have features that let you understand what's current and what's previous. And so what happens a lot with what we've seen in the publisher world is the most important asset that we have been exposed to in the publisher world is their user base, their user list. And the more they can grow their first party user list, the more additional revenue streams they can unlock or enhance, whether that be driving people to events, getting subscribers for a paid, behind the wall a newsletter, understanding more about their traffic so they can sell first party audiences more efficiently. And so the more information they can have about their first party audience, the more revenue they can unlock. And so what happens, what we've seen a lot with publishers is they'll have a lot of first party data that's out of date. People work at different jobs, they have old emails, old addresses. So one of the first and easiest things you can do is keep that fresh. A big part we've seen is publishers on average may only be able to identify a few percent of their traffic going to their website. And the majority of it, they're selling a lot of times on the open RTB and at fractions of a cost, with probably some of the funnel of revenue they can generate. That's some of the least high margin revenue out of that funnel, from obviously getting subscribers, driving events, selling first party audience. And so what the graph allows is it allows us to really help touch each one of their revenue strategies and help enhance that with fresher data. So they'll have a cookie or a device going to their website that they know nothing about. That's not, or very little about, I'd say. Maybe they know that the device is reading a piece of article, but they know nothing about the person there. They don't know what kind of income range they're in, what kind of job they work for. Is it in an ICP? They don't know any of that. And it's really hard to generate a lot of revenue off of that without all that other information. So that's really what we're seeing the graph is helping publishers with. This is what, when we were talking about you brought up the concept on the walled gardens, one of the things that we feel very confident on is you look at the major walled gardens out there with Google and Meta and Amazon and Microsoft, and all of them generate a tremendous amount of revenue off their platforms. And if you look at one of the key components all of them have, they all have incredibly strong identity graphs. And that's one of the reasons they can charge such a premium for their inventory, because they're targeting so good. That's one of the things we've seen publishers start to struggle with, especially as they've gotten away from mailing as much. It's a lot of digital first party data, and that's very hard to keep up to date and fresh.
So let me feed some of that back to you. It's fascinating, right? So one of the things, so in one way, what you just hit on with the walled gardens is, again, they're able to do this at scale within their systems because, again, people use them, they log in, and then they collect data over time. As a publisher, I one time you used to have long registration forms, right? And you would force people to go through and ask all, I myself do not care to be asked about my household income, right? But I'd have to get access to something. So money publishers have kind of reduced the amount that they actually ask, but they still need that information at a size that they can create data products from, right? And so it
Yes,
sounds like
and
you're able to help fill some of those other gaps in so that if I do in fact have someone log into my site or sign up, if I have an email address, I get a lot of information that I'm really in no position to ever collect.
Yes, and one thing to think about. So even if you as the publisher are asking that information, it's kind of to the analogy I've heard someone talk about with Tesla and self-driving cars. When you make a mistake, you as Rob on the road, only you learned that mistake. When a self-driving car and Tesla makes the statements on these is there are hundreds of thousands or millions of cars all get to learn that mistake. So with the cooperative, when one co-op member sends an email and it bounces, the entire cooperative gets to benefit from that learning, and or if it still works. So it really allows a publisher that will never have most likely the footprint to be able to collect all that information and keep it fresh, even if they had a really engaging user base that was comfortable answering all those questions. They don't have to now. We get to aggregate all of those learnings at scale. And I think that's one of no matter how big of a publisher you are, or any sort of member in the cooperative, that's probably the best benefit that we're seeing from members.
Yeah, and again, it feels like with the variety of data sources that you have, it creates some really kind of unique pieces. I think there's one other concept that you hit on there, that this is not just about ad targeting, right? This is something about knowing your users, again, whether it be email address, cookie, or any other kind of ID. And again, you can please correct me if I'm overstating or understating like that piece. But the fact is that I can look at that and go, I can now tell a story about my audience. I can go and say, I know something about my audience that, again, I previously did not know. Um, and it's up to date, right? That's a key point you just made. And then, again, I can work out exactly how I activate against that. Does that inform this strategy, that strategy, and so forth? So it's not, because I think one of the things that you probably run into is people trying to put you into a category, right? And so I understand that you're going to help me with my data. Maybe there's another way to frame this. What isn't 5 by 5? What
Yeah.
don't you do?
So here's what we're not. We're not a list broker where a publisher could get 10,000 or 100,000 contacts and can email them and try to engage some activity. What 5 by 5 is we're baked into the very fabric of somebody's product or service, where data is a critical component to them generating revenue. So we tend to work with heads of data, heads of digital audience, heads of product or engineering, less so the chief revenue officer who needs a list for his, or chief marketing officer that needs a list to be able to do outreach. And so I think that's one of the things that we have seen in the third party data world is a meaningful chunk of the options out there are meant for a marketer or sales leader. They're not meant for a product or audience or service leader to be able to improve their products. And as a result, the data that they're getting isn't really well fitted for their needs. The licensing terms aren't quite there. The access isn't quite there. There's a lot of probabilistic linkages that are really tough to build products off of. And so we built 5 by 5 because we were building a product and we needed the data this way. It wasn't really a overwhelmingly conscious decision outside of we just needed it this way. And it turned out a lot of other people needed it this way as well. And so I think that's why when we're on the phone with a product or audience or data leader, they tend to really gravitate towards the way the co-op is built off of this. It's basically this massive observation network of activity. And so that seems to resonate a lot with product leaders.
And yeah, this co-op thing is really interesting. So one of the things that I know my audience is going to react to is privacy concerns, and again, like making sure that we're building things that have are going to exist in the future. Can you talk a little bit about again this cooperative and how that particular part, how you address that?
So our point of view is privacy will always be evolving. So I think one of the nice things with the cooperative model is it's very flexible or anti-fragile because we have this diverse co-op membership profile. So if a certain type of data access or feed becomes irrelevant because Apple or Google make an update in their kind of sandbox, or there's a public privacy law that changes, we can always invite a new class or category of members into the co-op to help potentially fill that data need. And so we built the co-op just to be able to navigate with changing privacy laws. Now, in current privacy laws, there's a few things that we do focus on. So one, it's US based data. So we follow the core kind of tenets on giving people the ability to opt out, or users the ability to opt out of our data set. We do a whole permissioning set on our data to say, hey, you're in the 5x5 data cooperative. As a user, if you don't want to be, here's your ability to opt out. And then all of our members represent warrant that they have the permissions and ability from a user privacy standpoint, terms of service, to be able to contribute what they contribute. A lot of times what co-op members contribute is signal level data. So you'll have a hashed email and was the email opened or clicked? So you're not getting the conversational threads or sometimes even the underlying PII. So we work with each member what they feel comfortable and have the ability to contribute. And then we aggregate that all into a full graph. So the data we have in the graph is contributed by multiple members. So it's not unique really to one specific member or workflow.
Got it.
It's
So
a,
that, I mean,
it's
that
a
was
movie, not a snapshot as privacy. It's a lot of things added up to be, from our point of view, to be able to be compliant and protect the users.
got it. Got it. Yeah, I mean that addresses a big concern, and then also I think you addressed the other concern is what am I contributing? What control do I have, and how does that work? And so got it. So then I'm able to, again, and I love this concept, and it's something that I will say, we're seeing more and more within the publisher world of how do we work together? How do we just sit there and figure out ways to grow what we have to work with, because again, the walled gardens are so big compared to us in scale, that what I'm hearing is, again, this isn't even just getting some other like publishers together to create a segment. It's going across some other verticals here
Yeah,
that,
data they've never had access to.
right?
And so our vision with 5x5 is we want to create the largest identity graph outside of the big walled gardens. We don't ever imagine 5x5 specifically taking down or directly competing with any of the walled gardens. What we feel is we will enable the next generation of companies that compete and take market segment from the big walled gardens. So that if you look at the big wall gardens, some of the core tenets that have helped them build their walls up, identity graph, all of them have a incredibly accurate and powerful identity graph. For the longest time, it was AI. And it was, oh, well, we can never invest in that kind of AI to be able to compete with the Googles and Facebooks of the world. Well, that wall is starting to come down. You have compute power, and that wall. So like these walls are starting to come down, and it's starting to become a little more democratized. And so I think the publishers, from what we've been hearing, have been getting a lot of pressure and squeezed from those walled gardens. And we feel there's a big opportunity to have that shift. And you're seeing it with the antitrust laws coming out with Google, and the government starting to catch on a little bit to this. So we do believe that there's some wind in the sails. And we think we have one of the big, not the only, but one of the big components to help. And we think that's kind of a big part of the next phase of publishers' revenue strategies.
I want to circle back to the what 5x5 is not. It's what I'm hearing is that it's not a DMP or a CDP. It's the data itself. Is that an
We're the
accurate?
data, yes. So we work with CDPs. A CDP is really only and they can be incredibly useful, but they're really only as useful as the data you have to put into them. We use the analogy as their refrigerator, but they don't come stocked with food, right?
Oh,
And so that's one of the gaps we've seen with CDPs is a publisher will onboard the meaningful part of their first party data. It connects it all, but if there's not good data connecting it all, then it doesn't really mesh well. And so it doesn't, we're finding in many cases, it's not generating the meaningful ROI that publishers are looking for on its own. Now, we do think a publisher's first party data with a CDP platform with our data on top of that can be incredibly powerful. CDP is a tech platform. So there's no reason I would suggest a publisher build that platform themselves, but it does need that. Either the publisher has to have incredibly rich first party data, and kind of cheers to them, for to take advantage of the CDP. And if it doesn't, we're an incredibly or an identity graphing solution is incredibly valuable to help get a return on investment out of those CDPs.
As I've been evaluating this, and again, so I was lucky enough at golf.com where I inherited a CDP, but it was like a blank. Your refrigerator analogy is now the analogy you're going to hear me say at some point in some place, because I was using a blank slate just in terms of blank sheet of paper. Like it was just something of starting a data strategy from ground zero, from nothing. It's incredibly difficult to get to the point of getting a return on it.
The
And
cold
so one
start
of
problem,
these,
little chicken and the egg
right.
issue.
And what I'm hearing from you is that I can take, whether it be cookie, maids, email, like there's a number of different things that I have, again, depending, again, in this fragmented world I work in, that I can start to pull that stuff together, and then I get some access to information I wouldn't, potentially at scale, for me to create data products that I myself otherwise would not be able to do because I'm not collecting that kind of data.
Yeah, back to the identity graph here is, we start with the kind of core persistent ID, and you want to connect every sort of demographic or engaging variable you can into this graph. So you want to have address level data for mailing initiatives. You want to have email for obviously email, phone calling. You want to have the full device graph with cookies and maids and IP addresses for different targeting mechanisms. Once you have that all in, it enables you the ability to create interesting audiences. So, you could figure out, who's in market for certain solutions, and then you have demographic data to be able to potentially prioritize. So one of the analogies we always talk about is, everyone's in market for a Ferrari or, type of thing, but who's actually qualified to buy, right? And so I think as a publisher, having that additional either insight to enhance that audience and having additional devices so that audience is targetable and reachable opens up a tremendous amount of control. So you can control that in you create your own little walled garden in this example. So the 5x5 is delivering meaningful amounts of that data. So the publisher can house that in their own infrastructure. So they can create different audience segments. They can do it in or outside of LiveRamp. They can push them to Trade Desk or Xandr or any sort of destination. So it really gives them that flexibility to not be beholden to, some of this you can do with LiveRamp that I've described, but now you have to do it all in LiveRamp and their tax and that's so it really gives them the control back. And LiveRamp, in our point of view, is another version of a walled garden, not as big as the, kind of the big 4 or 5, but they really do kind of, from our point of view, operate a lot of monopolistic characteristics where they don't like to share a lot of the material for you to build it in your own house. So that's something that we're starting to see.
I do think that that's for any publisher that is heard me talk about this, there is this need for each publisher that needs to create a brand, and you need to have a narrative. And there's a part of this that is really interesting, that being able to go out to market with your own segments as and populate it at a level that makes sense, starts to be able to do that. And then of course I'm still thinking about the fact you mentioned that an email bounces and that updates my data. That's huge. And I think in the gold rush of all publishers of collecting more and more email addresses, because that's so much of identity that's transacted on is based off of that. But what people aren't paying as much attention to is legitimate email addresses, engaged email addresses. Then of course, once they bounce, you want that stuff out of there, because otherwise you're
Well, and do they
really.
have an alternative? So maybe it bounces and that's where the graph can help. Well, what's the new email? Did they put in a consumer email and you're a B2B publisher and you want their B2B persona, right? So there's a lot of value lost in just the publisher's ability to collect information. And to what you said earlier, they want the more information they ask for, the less engagement.
Yep.
So this could potentially help publishers collect a little less information, improve engagement, and then we could as the publisher, you can backfill some of that key information that you would have normally asked in a sign up flow. You can just backfill because you have the underlying data behind the scenes. So it gives the publishers a lot of control over their strategy, and that's something that we've seen that they've been losing control a lot over the last decade or so.
And so from a publisher who's listening to you, one, I was thinking about asking you kind of how they should approach you. I'm going to hold on that for a second and actually ask the question about what could they expect? So based on some of the publishers that you've worked with, again, let's use a scenario, a site that doesn't have a lot of logged in users, but a lot of email, a lot of newsletters, and so forth. What might they expect to be able to do? What might be some of the things that you've seen? I know your network is blind, which I also really kind of appreciate that you aren't out there naming all the names and so forth like that. I think that that ultimately is going to benefit you and the people that are part of your community. But again, if I'm a user and I have all this data to share with you, what might I expect? What have you seen?
Yeah, it's a good question on that. So the publishers where we've seen get the most value from working with us tend to have a very focused appreciation or a goal around building that first party audience. And so the the devil's in the what does that building mean? So is it you have, and I'll use the example, you have 1 million first party users in your publisher network. Is it expanding the information on them so you have better demographic, you can charge a premium audience revenue? Is it expanding the ability to target them so there could be more bids on that audience, or the advertisers can target them in more areas? Is it the ability to create custom audiences? So now you can sell custom behavioral audiences. We work with publishers who want the ability to grow their first party audience. So we've seen publishers, there's workflows around, obviously, if somebody signs up for a newsletter, that's one way of building your first party audience that you can engage and invite them to events and sign up for different services. We're also seeing is that's anywhere from maybe 2 to 3% of full visitors to a website fit that, actually fill out a form. The other 90 something percent do not. And so the ability to understand who they are and add to that list. So we work with a lot of publishers on how to grow that audience list from 1 million to 2 to 3 million. And what does that do to the rest of the revenue streams? And so we really centered all of this graph and the capabilities is around the data they have, either expanding it or enhancing it. And that's where I would recommend publishers focus, whether that be with us or wherever they're focusing on their data strategy.
What I like is how much of this conversation that we have just had without hitting every difficult understand, like all the words and all the buzzwords around this stuff. What you just said about just articulating, just expanding what you have or enriching what you have, and then the fact that depending as a publisher, what your goals are. And by the way, I have all the goals you just listed as a publisher, right?
Sure.
But there is a place of sitting there going like, where do you start? Like again, as a publisher, you have to sit there and look and see and do that. And I know that's something that you do work with a lot of publishers on is, hey, let's take a look at the data. Let's run a test. Let's see if things work and get an idea of exactly what kind of picture
Well,
you're able to paint.
if you can expand that first party audience and both of these, that doesn't have to be in this order of goal, but the way we look at it is if we can expand the first party audience, that should expand their existing first party audience revenue streams. There's more people, bigger audiences. Second thing, can we help you is give you more revenue streams off of that first party audience. And so that's what we're looking at, both lenses. So we work with some publishers that have incredibly mature revenue streams off their first party audiences with events and subscribers and first party audience sales and intent behavioral audience. So they've built that horizontal. If they get a user, they have maybe a half a dozen revenue streams or a dozen revenue streams. So all they're coming to us is, can you get us more users? We know what our revenue per user is. There's a whole other set of publishers that there are revenue streams they've never unlocked because they didn't know how to or have the data to be able to do that. And that's the other area. So our recommendation is if you're a publisher that has not figured out quite a few revenue streams off of your first party data, focus there. You've already done the hard work of getting the users in. Can we generate more revenue per user? And if you're a mature publisher, really it's just, can we get more users into your first party user database, and then they can take it from there.
Got it. Listen, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and this is extremely helpful, I think, again, painting the picture of what your company does. Some really interesting things there. And again, the idea that how this started, in terms of the problem that you solved, the fact that you went with more of a community, co-op approach is really, really intriguing. I think at a time when, again, everyone is walled gardening themselves, this creates an opportunity for publishers that are looking to go, look, I'll work with others to create something bigger and everyone benefit from that. I think is going to be what you see more and more publishers do. And so I think really, Nick, we've covered a lot of ground. I think I know of one particular call of action which I'm going to make, which is that we are going to be 5x5 is going to be at Basecamp Denver. And in fact, there's actually going to be a session about why publishers need identity graph. We have Ryan Whittington from ACBJ is going to be there talking about his experience with that. And but someone might want to get to talk to you before that. So who should they reach out to?
And what we found is this is tough and it's hard to do alone. We've met with a lot of publishers and people where the data being a core part of their strategy, it's hard to navigate all the different brokers and options out there. So that's what this cooperative is about. It's really bridging that gap from being alone. And so my recommendation would be, especially on the publisher side, if you're interested, is to reach out to Tim Bradbury. So it's just Tim at 5x5coop.com. It's definitely one of those conversations is probably the best starting place with us.
And if you know Tim, I'm sure you have other options of other people you could talk to, if Tim's the big barrier. And yes, I'm saying that because Tim is listening, and Tim's an old friend of mine, and I get to do that on these things. I get that freedom.
Well, I
Anyway,
like the idea of blowing up Tim's weekend plans. So
100%. Let's keep Tim busy. So everyone reach out, and let's all set that you're available to meet at Friday at 3 o'clock, and let's just sit there and set them up. Anyway, Nick, it really was a pleasure talking to you. This is our first chance really to get and dive into all this stuff. And again, I'm going to just compliment you on your ability to navigate what can easily be a super technical conversation. And I'm sure some of our audience is going to want that super complicated conversation, and that's great. But understanding exactly what the opportunity is here is great. I think that was, I really enjoyed our conversation. So looking forward, Nick, to the next one.
yeah, thanks, Rob. And if there is any individuals that do want that double click on the technical side, there's definitely a lot more to dive into that, and happy to be a part of that as well. But yeah, Rob, thanks for having us, or thanks for having me
You
specifically.
got it. Thanks for everyone tuning in for our first impressions with 5x5, and look forward to our next one. Thank you.